Hello everybody. In this video I'd like to introduce a new political concept that will end corruption in Congress in a phase 1, will help to rein in the deep state in a phase 2, and greatly empower the American people throughout. It depends on computer power, and it's the sort of concept that our founders would have envisioned if computers had been available in their day. Now, the only tool that has ever been found to successfully counter political corruption is to check political ambition with rival political ambition in an overall balance of powers. Now, this is the overarching theme of our Constitution. The concept that we'll look at today uses the same approach by establishing a new balance of powers as a subset within Congress itself. Now, this could be done without a constitutional amendment. It would only require a change of the rules in both houses. Here's what I mean. Think for a moment about the familiar concept of the line item veto, but in reverse. I'm talking about line item legislation. Now here's how that would work. When legislation is offered today in the form of a bill, it can become as thick as a phone book. There needs to be a little something in it for everyone, which incurs vast amounts of wasteful spending. But even more importantly, there can be huge compromise over guiding principles. This is where corruption comes in. Now, line item legislation would begin by redefining those bills as a legislative package. Now, for technical purposes, this means that every item within that package is now considered a line item bill in itself, which allows those congressmen to vote by the same distinctions. Based on standard voting over line item bills, each congressman could vote their true political colors on every item every time. Their voting decisions would be prepared during a study period. Optionally, they could attach comments to explain their decisions. These would appear in an unofficial background record rather than being part of the legislation itself. We'll have more to say on that later. When the vote is called for, their input will be uploaded from a flash drive to a mainframe, which would quickly process majority returns. Only those items with a genuine majority of support would make it into the approved version of the package. This procedure would establish a new currency in Congress, so to speak. Rather than legislators building a career based on how much pork they can bring home to their districts, they would distinguish themselves by the integrity of their principles and their wisdom in preventing the excess of their colleagues, by spending taxpayer money wisely to protect the folks back home from such wastefulness. In other words, for doing the business of the country rightly. Meanwhile, the same process would be taking place in the Senate. Now, after the legislative packages are approved in each house, they would meet together in a conference committee to craft their compromise legislation. Now, here they would be bound by another new rule that is called realistic parameters. This would limit the conference members to working with the material that their two houses have authorized. For example, if an item is approved in both versions of the legislation, then obviously it must be included in the compromise legislation. But if it's the same basic item with two different parameters, such as the amount allocated for funding, it must be adopted with an allocation that falls somewhere between the two authorized amounts. Realistic parameters are defined between the two differences. Now, if an item is in neither version of the legislation, the committee cannot add it. If it is in one version but not in the other, those become their bargaining chips. All, some, or none of those items may make it into the final version of the legislation as the committee reaches agreement. Now, before the committee is adjourned, they have one last decision to make. They must decide on the form that this legislation will take as it is returned to each house for another round of voting. Now, for this, they will have two choices: the legislative option or the executive option. Under the legislative option, the packages will become a single bill to be returned to each house for another round of voting, just as it is done at present. If it is approved in both houses, it will proceed to the President's desk for signature or veto. Now, the big difference would appear if the executive option was chosen. Under the executive option, the legislation would be returned to each house again as a legislative package of line item bills, but it would be returned on a fast-track basis. Now, legislators have already expressed their views over the individual line items in the original round of voting. So what they're voting on now is their willingness to accept the overall package as a compromise. Now, under the executive option, If the legislative package is approved in both houses, it would be sent to the president in that form. That would allow him to approve or disapprove different parts of that legislation on a line item basis. Now please note, this is not a line item veto. It merely emulates it in purpose. It is a standard veto over line item bills and is agreeable to the Constitution as it stands. Now the executive option would only be evoked rarely because it transfers power to the president. But having said, there may be times when that trade-off is considered worth having. For example, when legislation is submitted that would avert a government shutdown, this would force the president to define his political stance to the nation, since the Constitution requires him to explain every veto he gives for entering the congressional records. And of course, any veto he gives could still be overridden by a 2/3 majority of both houses. Now, line item legislation will require specialized software for processing information. But this is also the first step into a much larger world, because this will give the folks back home the ability to monitor everything at every stage through the internet, and even to unofficially participate through email, chat rooms, comments, etc. In a special feature, the entire legislative package could be recreated in a companion mode for unofficial participation back home. Now this would be called shadow legislation. The folks back home could sign up to vote over the legislative package or any part of it as if they were the representative. Optionally, they could attach comments for a background record to explain their recommendations, just as the legislators themselves may do. If a legislator is undecided over any particular item, he may consult the shadow legislation from his district to see the mind of his constituents. He may even ask the computer to process their advice and generate majority returns. Now, if one of those optional comments contains a rationale that he especially likes, he may even cut and paste it into his own comments in the real legislation while giving credit to his constituent. I'm supporting this measure because of the rationale best expressed by my constituent, Miss Janice Brown, as follows. Now, how's that for showing the folks back home that you are representing them? Finally, shadow legislation could provide interested persons with training and experience in how to become a legislator and equip them with a shadow voting record. This could help ensure a better quality of candidate in elections to come. Now, for almost 100 years, progressive government agencies have combined the executive, legislative, and judicial functions of state into a single body in their own specialized area of expertise. Now, the constitutionality of this arrangement has always been questionable. It certainly violates the Constitution's separation of powers doctrine, and it creates a bureaucracy that is largely unaccountable to the public. But how would this be corrected today? Since the legislative role belongs to the Congress and not the agencies, only Congress is truly capable of reining in the legislative parts of the agencies. This is where Phase 2 begins. Now, Congress would start by loading the standing rules from those agencies into the line item legislation software. Then, in a series of public hearings in the appropriate committees, they would review those rules, amend them as necessary, and vote over accepting or rejecting them in line item fashion, just as they would do with the legislative package. Now, potentially this could be done by the committee alone, although some process should exist for appealing to the entire Congress if necessary. Meanwhile, the judicial parts of those agencies should be separated from them, including separate officing, reporting structures, etc., to create a completely separate judiciary as the question of the agency courts is addressed. Now, once that question is settled, assuming those courts continue in some form, those judges would face review for recommendation by the President with approval from the Senate in order to transfer into the new positions. In the meantime, any case requiring judgment from one of the agency judges will be handled by a judge from one of the other agencies with a similar area of expertise, rather than the judges from the agency that's involved in the litigation. Obviously, those judges have a conflict of interest which requires their recusal. Now, once Congress assumes control of the legislative functions of the agencies, and their judicial functions are separated from them, this would leave their enforcement functions subject to the executive branch alone. Separating the powers within the agencies will defeat the Humphreys executor limitation and will return each function to the jurisdiction where it most properly belongs. So basically, line item legislation is a tool to help restore the government to its intended concepts and functions. Now, this has been the quick version of this concept, and objections will be raised, but they've usually been anticipated, and I assure you they can be answered. So perhaps we can discuss those in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video from Pulpit of the Last Days, short essays about the end-time church as foretold in the New Testament. If you did enjoy it, please go ahead and click on that thumbs up button. For previous videos, check out our website at pulpitofthelastdays.com. Also, we post new videos weekly, so if you'd like to receive more videos like this one, all you need to do is subscribe.